Thanks, Ross, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. So, as Ross says, 10 minutes maybe of slides. I've got 17 this time. There isn't a lot, well, there is actually a huge amount to cover on this site, but given the complexities of the war and the monuments, this is an introduction to this site. So, this first slide illustrates the Atlantic Wall Museum in Normandy, and it shows the offensive face. So a network of concrete installations was installed by the Germans or the Nazis, I should say, to secure their ill-gotten gains. Now, the title here, the most important archaeological site, relates to the fact that I believe that D-Day is amongst the most important events in world history, and therefore anything connected to D-Day is important. And as you shall find out, the Atlantic Wall is one of the most tangible and concrete, no pun intended, pieces of evidence for our involvement in D-Day. Anyway, slide 2, please, Ross. Now, this map, which I saw off the internet, mainly because of its bright colours, and it basically shows occupied Europe. Now, I noticed afterwards that it is rather charitable to the Russians, and it doesn't show the impact of the pact between the non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin that resulted in the splitting of Poland. However, it gives you an idea. And just to remind you, the Nazis started to invade differing parts of Europe. There is the Sudetenland, the elements of Czechoslovakia, and an initial phase of appeasement, notably led by Chamberlain, the British minister, who famously or infamously declared that he had met Mr. Hitler and had secured peace in our time. All that actually happened was that Hitler continued to invade, taking everybody else, and Chamberlain obviously had to resign. In the name of God, go, I think is the quote, and Churchill took over. So we have the Allies from the rest of the world, and eventually the Russians see sense, mainly because the Germans invade them. The Germans are then operating on two fronts. So the Allies are Britain and the former colonies, the Americans and the Russians, although at this point it's the USSR, although Stalin invoked Mother Russia, reinvigorated Russian nationalism in what they now call the Great Patriarchal War. So we have two fronts, and we have how the hell are we going to invade occupied Europe? Right. Third slide. I just want to touch upon this very, very briefly. I do not think it is at all controversial to describe the Nazis, their ideology, as the most evil in the world ever. And obviously the key event of that is the Holocaust. I'm not going to dwell on it. There are individuals that deny the Holocaust, and I simply, whenever I'm asked about it, I simply put two first-hand evidence. Primo Levi, this is his account of life in Auschwitz and his journey back to Italy, and of course Anne Frank's diary. I think these are the two most famous accounts. Primo Levi famously said, of course, that the true witnesses to the Holocaust are all dead, because the survivors are not true witnesses. However, I think when we discuss World War II, it is important to assert the validity of the Holocaust and the actual evil of the Nazi regime. Next slide, please, Ross. Now, this one just gives you a section of, or an impression rather, of the defences, the fortifications that the Nazis constructed. And these defences run along the western coast of France. They're running all the way to Norway. There are differing sizes, but obviously the most heavily defended area is on the French side of the English Channel. This was where they expect to be attacked. Now, one of the interesting things about Germans and their technology is that the Germans had better design and technology in World War I. And through the 30s, they developed the Autobahn and actually had better concrete technology. So I don't know very much about the defences. And we have another slide here, slide 5, please, Ross. I'm not going to read all this out. You can read this out at your leisure. But basically to say that the plans for the Atlantic Wall were smuggled out by the out of occupied France in a biscuit tin by the French resistance. Dunblane Museum did a very big project along with Tony Pollard of Glasgow University, and the web link to all of the evidence and the review is added. Interesting enough, the British formed an anti-concrete committee. Another interesting thing is the Americans didn't seem to be very interested in research. They just figured out that they had enough men and enough material to actually just blast through whatever was there. The British wanted to work out what exactly was going on. And it should be said as well that clearly we're in Britain, we're in Scotland, Britain, that we have a particular fondness for World War II. And while we definitely played an important part, and while we absolutely abandoned fire for the sake of fighting the Germans, the Russians did most of the dying, and the Americans did most of the fighting. And we'll not forget the contribution of our allies in all of the former colonies, Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan, the African colonies, etc., as well as the Free French, the Free Polish fighters. Right, next slide, please, Ross. Now, in order to work out how to blast through this concrete, a series of top secret training and research grounds are established across Britain. And as I say, there's more detail on all of that aspect in the Dunblane Museum site. Now, our version of the Atlantic Wall was on the Sheriff Muir, just to the north east of Dunblane, in what is actually quite a hard location to get to, and very easy to control. You know, when you're driving up there, walking up there, you do feel you're all of a sudden you're in the Highlands or you know, the most remote part of Sutherland, and yet it is incredibly close to the Central Belt. Now, this was a top secret research and training ground. So one of the reasons that the site is so poorly understood is everybody that worked on it signed the Official Secrets Act, and actually it's just they kept stum. They didn't say anything about it. Now, there are accounts, however, of people, retired individuals who were children in Dunblane, seeing tanks travelling through the streets of Dunblane, and the soldiers that constructed the wall, whose details are on the Dunblane Museum website, stayed at Blackford on one of the farms there, and the current farmer remembers the troops being there. So an incredible secret. Now, next slide, please, Ross. Now, the first academic account of the wall was undertaken by the former Royal Commission, and this is available in a journal called The Fourth Naturalist and Historian, all of which is free and online, and you want volume 22. Now, what this plan here indicates is a mixture of offensive and defensive positions. And at the top right of the map, you can see debris and Atlantic wall. And then if you look to the left of that slide, you can see the road, sorry, the left of the Atlantic wall and debris. You can see the road that drives. And then to this, just immediately to the left of that, you can see coastline access track. And you can see a couple of small squares there. Now, what this from the coastline access track to the Atlantic wall and debris is uphill. And what this replicates is the point where the landing craft arrived. The landing craft are meant to be the two squares. These are high mounds. The soldiers jump down from that position, run past the road. The road replicates the start of the beach, and then you are running up to that gap. So I do urge you to go and see this yourself, and I'll have more slides on it later on. Now, in addition, there had actually been a long history of military training on Shirefmuir. Obviously, there is the battle from 1715, the Jacobite Rising. There are World War I trenches here underneath all of this. Very easy to see when you, if you actually walk up to the wall. And also, and intriguingly, some of the soldiers that trained on these World War I trenches actually fought at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles campaign, which we'll come on to later on. And finally, the name Sheriffmuir probably relates to medieval Wappenshaws, so a training ground. So a very long established military training ground here, and absolutely littered with remains. I should say that the wall and the training ground are all scheduled monuments, so protected by law, a nationally important monument. So if we get the next slide, please, Ross. Now, this just gives you an impression of the scale of the remains that are surviving. And these are all poured concrete. And these are my children. They're always very embarrassed when they see these pictures, so I use them as often as possible. You can see the impact of the mold for the concrete, the corrugated iron. You can see the reinforced the iron bars, and you can see just how hard wearing this material was. And indeed, so this is actually replicates German design, and it's clear from accounts that the wall was actually very successful. And some of these defences were actually very hard to beat. But what the Allies did on D-Day was simply blast through the wall and isolate these command centres and simply come back to them a few weeks down the line, a few days down the line. So, and the next slide, please, Ross. Now, this is my favourite, which is a Tobruk gun emplacement. This is based on the principle that you bury a tank in sand, and you can't see the tank, and to a certain extent it's protected from offensive fire. So we have my daughter Kirsty looking up one, and here we have one actually on the Atlantic wall in France with the gun still there. However, if we jump to the next slide, please. So this is the Atlantic wall here itself. So just to orientate you what you're looking at. So the people are walking through the anti-tank ditch. So that's infilled. Obviously, this is 70 years old. If you look at the blue circle, you can see not only the reinforced concrete, but you can see how resistant the wall is to missile fire. It takes a lot of damage. It's still a formidable barrier, even when missiles are fired at it. And also, if you look just to the left of the blue, you might be able to get the impression of the incline. So the anti-tank wall bevels out. So it's not just, if you imagine most ramparts are, let me think through this, a convex slope. this is actually in effect a concave slope. So it's actually much harder for a tank to drive up over. Then if you look beyond to the red circle, you can see the remains of barbed wire holders that ran along the top of the wall. So actually you've got a very, very formidable, probably I think 4 meter high barrier. Now, as I said before, the ground is both a research ground and a training ground. So let's next slide, please. So one of the main elements here was to actually figure out how tanks might blow up the wall. And many of you might have heard of Hobart's funnies, which were a series of innovative tank designs that were designed to go through, operate in different conditions, actually, to physically blast the wall, a variety of things. So we've got 3 images here. We've got one of the specially designed tanks going over an element of training ground elsewhere. We've got a picture of my daughters again. And just to reinforce that, reinforce this image, that's the wall surviving the impact of a missile. The slide at the bottom is the hole created by the blast. Now, one of the things that the Hobart funnies, eventually they figured out how to blow up the wall, which is that the tank had a missile attached to its turret. It had to go from the beach all the way up to the wall, plant the bomb on the wall, then retreat. And I think you've got a blast. I mean, that hole is 2 to 3 meters wide. The blast material, the debris, goes back 20, 30 meters. So an enormous explosion, an absolutely huge explosion. Now, having figured out the tactics and the level of munitions required to blow up the wall, the next stage was to use this gap as a training ground. So next slide, please, Ross. So I mentioned before that people were running from in effect, the mocked up shoreline. But one of the things to remember here is there is only one hole. And when you do visit, and I do advise you to visit, but please be very, very careful. You will notice just how much rebar there is. And if you actually walk through this hole, you will find that the rebar itself has become a defensive, the broken bits of the iron rebar project outwards to anybody running up towards the wall. And it's actually an uneven surface full of pointy bits of metal. Now, the training itself was live fire. Now you can see the impact of smaller gauge munitions, bullets on the iron rebar here on the photograph to the bottom right. We know at least one individual died on the training ground. I'm afraid I cannot remember his name. I was told it back in 2014, but I cannot find my notes. But one person died. Now that is either from an accident, friendly fire, or perhaps they just fell on some of the rebar. Now, all of this, of course, is to figure out how to blow up the wall, and then how the troops were going to go through that wall. Now, let me just see where I am with my notes. One of the interesting things is that none of the troops that actually trained at the Atlantic Wall actually were then used in the land invasion, and the troops that did do the land invasion didn't actually train on the wall, which is, it's a bit interesting. Right, and I want to move slightly forward to D-Day itself. So next slide, please, Ross. Now, D-Day itself had to overcome the shadow of the Gallipoli campaign, or the sea landings at Gallipoli, part of the Dardanelles campaign. These were a total disaster. One of the problems, see 160,000 troops died. Churchill had to resign from his position in the cabinet and actually signed up, rather interestingly. The general that commanded them, Ian Hamilton, is actually buried outside Doon at Old Kilmadock, a very prominent grave. One of the problems was that they were just simply ill prepared for the landing. You can see the geography, very hard to attack and invade and get up those slopes. Simultaneously, they took too long to prepare, so the Turks actually knew where they were going to land. Absolutely incredible. So these lessons were learnt for D-Day, which was the largest single amphibious invasion ever. And I was trying to see if I have the figures, but I cannot find where I've put the figures for the. Oh no, they're further on. Don't worry. So one of the, if we get the next slide, please, Ross. So, in order to avoid the chief mistake of the Dardanelles campaign, you cannot let the Germans know where you intend to invade. Now, obviously, the easiest route is from the south of England, but there would be no harm in sowing confusion. This is where Operation Fortitude comes in. And Operation Fortitude envisaged, I think, 13 or 14 differing locations where the Allies might invade, and then having invaded, actually move forward to Germany. Now, Operation Fortitude North concerned Stirling. So the next slide, please, Ross. Now, Fortitude North concerned an invasion of Norway. And what we have is a very, very clever plan. Spies, double agents, we have their names here, and there are lots of information on Fortitude North. You can get a couple of very good books explaining it all online. So Garbo, you've got Brutus, spies, suggesting that there are large numbers of troops in Edinburgh, Dundee, Stirling. At the same time, we have a whole series of fake radio traffic between the fictitious units, coordinated by this Colonel MacLeod, although afterwards Colonel MacLeod suggests that he wasn't sure the radio traffic had any impact. And to combine, in addition to all of this, Eisenhower and the Norwegian king in exile made speeches asking Norwegian resistance not to act too soon. Now, this, as you see, the trick worked, and perhaps 12 divisions, perhaps over 100,000 men remained in Norway. Now, clearly, the diversion of those troops would have an enormous impact on the success of the D-Day landing. So, next slide, please. Now, this is just a little bit of fun. So, in addition to Fortitude North and the fake units, there were fake tanks up near the North Third, but in complete contrast, in addition to creating fake units, actual installations were obliterated, well, were actually covered up and made secret. So this is the Bandief World War I military base, which is there, and we can see the 2004 Google Earth image. And here we have the 1945 RAF pictures where the munitions base is completely eroded and or completely covered up and gone, so that anybody finding the official RAF pictures would not know that there was a base there. I think that's fascinating. Right, next slide, please, Ross. So this is my final slide, and simply to say the conclusion. 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion ever. 5,000 ships, 175,000 troops, 15 different nations. I mean, the mind boggles at the level of sophistication and coordination to achieve that. And I'm afraid our current response to COVID pales into insignificance. So my conclusion is that this, I believe, is the most important, if not one of the most important events in world history. It is the start of the end of the Nazis, and it began at Dunblane. at the Atlantic Wall. And of course, I have to pay thanks to Tony Pollard, who came up with this great line, checks in the post, Tony. Anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much. A pleasure and very interesting as always. If I can invite anybody to put their hands together for a round of applause, you can unmute yourself if you'd like as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. So we'll go to the Q&A part of the session. So as always, if you have any questions, do raise your hands, we'll get through to you, or you can alternatively put a question in the chat. So yeah, if anybody's got any questions, just raise your hand. No. Junko, the Cooper. Yeah. Oh. Sorry, I think I've went unmuted you.
Okay.
Yeah, we can. Sorry, we can hear you.
I certainly can hear someone.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you, Murray, and thanks for all the comments to Tony. I'll pass them on.
Yes. He gets very annoyed if he's not given full credit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there any structures, any other structures around the place which suggest the security arrangements that were in place? Are there any guard posts or accommodation blocks or anything like that, which is less military?
Well, nothing on site. The accommodation is at the farm at Blackford, and I think the details of that are on the Dunblane Museum website, and they were literally in the farm buildings. It would be incredibly easy to stop anybody getting up the site. I mean, from the east, there's the road from Causeway Head, which would be incredibly easy to block. I mean, it's just a guy with a gun anywhere from the Myatt forward, and the road from Bridge of Allen equally. And then, I think there are four or five access points at absolute most, and all of these are still single track roads. So one of the problems is there was a resident of Dunblane who actually helped construct the wall, but I'm afraid his memories went by the time anybody interviewed him, and but no one has talked about those. But of course, everybody signed the Official Secrets Act, and we do know how compliant most people in Britain were to the war effort. I mean, you simply have to read George Orwell's war presentations for the BBC to find out how much a free speech champion like George Orwell altered his views and is actively engaged in government propaganda on behalf of the war effort, and propaganda in the nicest sense rather than a negative sense.
It would be really nice to know how many people in Dunblane can actually recall the training going on up there, and if they can't, maybe that was a good indication it was kept really secret. Well,
I've spoken to two people, the farmer at Blackford and a gentleman who is now in Callander, and there was, as I say, this third individual who actually worked on the wall. So really, we are looking at a handful of people at absolute most who remember it. I'm sure if we went back 20 years, you go back even the 1970s, 1980s, we'd find lots of people. One of another difficulty about the wall is that it continued to be used as an MOD base, an active firing range into the 70s, and currently, so a lot of the damage might actually be later. It's not clear which is 1940s damage and which is 1970s damage. The wall itself is currently part of the organic buffer zone for Highland Spring, interestingly enough.
Thank you very much for that question, John. If we go to Robert, I think you had your hand up, and then we'll come to Sam. Who's got a question in the chat. Robert Wingate.
Hello?
Robert, can you hear it? Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
No, that's no problem. We can hear you now, Robert. Fine.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry.
So, Robert, did you have a question?
I don't have a question, no.
Oh, sorry. No, I thought you had your hand raised. My apologies.
Sorry.
All right, so we'll go to the question from Sam here in the chat. Asks, does the Atlantic Wall have any connections to David Stirling, the SAS, where his operations were limited to North Africa rather than the concentrating on the storming beaches?
There is no known connection at the moment. He's not mentioned. Certainly, the broader area is owned by. I mean, there are lots of Stirlings. So the Stirling of Keir, the Stirling of Kippendavy, and they are all cousins and second cousins. So it's likely that his family have had some connection, but him personally, there's nothing I've seen to connect him to it.
And another question for James is asking: is there still unexploded ordnance in the area, and has this been subject to UXP searches?
Undoubtedly, there will still be ordnance all over the place. This is me simply giving my opinion. There has been no survey in recent years. There may have been something in the 70s, but there's certainly nothing remotely done in the last 10 years. For that, it's now in private ownership, so it's not the. I have some familiarity with the process and the costs and the budgets involved. So I think it's extremely unlikely that anything will happen. But if you do go and have a walk, you can certainly see not only the damage to the wall from the shells, but you can certainly see the craters for explosive material or caused by explosive material.
Excellent. Are there other questions? If you just want to raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself. Round to room. Oh, sorry, John Cooper again.
Yeah, just one final one. How accurate were the fortifications? Has any comparison been made to the actuals against the dummies, as it were?
Oh, now I would have thought that Tony would know that better than me. It was always talked about. Now, certainly the sheriff, I think the project as envisaged by Tony was going to involve surveys of them all, and then comparison with the actual remains on the ground. I think the funding dried up. There was talk of getting the military involved at one point, but it was very complicated. Certainly, the wall as reconstructed at Sheriffmuir changes its character along its length, and I was never entirely sure if that was to reflect two different sections of the wall, two different designs, or if it was simply that the MOD, the soldiers that constructed it, actually just ran out of concrete, perhaps. But certainly the wall as planned in occupied Europe was not constructed to the degree that particular intent. And again, I think he has far more of this this material to hand.
So I don't think there's any more questions. So I'll just like take the time again, Molly, to say thank you very much.
That's okay. No problem. A delight, as always, Ross.
It has been. So if I can get asked everyone to again put your hands together and give a round of applause for fantastic Molly.
Thank you very much, everyone.
We'll look forward to seeing you all next week.